Hello everyone, today we talk about the warfare of the Kingdom of Arles/Burgundy between the 11th and the 14th century, let's say the mid-11th and mid-14th century for my series about kind of basic warfare of basically all the Eurasian and kind of Mediterranean medieval cultures, let's put it in this way. So we're talking about the Holy Roman Empire, and specifically one area that, as we will see now, is fairly compact, right? The amount of sources is less than our usual video, because mostly they take on this kind of provincial dimension when the powers are contained, right? Whereas they become a bit more pulpy when the thing is regional. We made different videos say, I don't know, medieval German warfare was consistently more dense than, say, Portuguese warfare, just because we're talking about very even different in size realities. Now, the Kingdom of Burgundy Arles, we had fortunately the pleasure of discussing, especially in the last year, right? Even several months, we talk about properly about the kingdom, about the Dauphin. We talked about even some provincial rulers recently. So we have framed it, I think, in a way that no other channel that I'm aware of is really, taking in consideration, and I plan naturally on expanding that because it's a very interesting frontier area. So we've seen what we're talking about. This would be the kingdom of, again, Arles, also known as of Burgundy, which was created essentially in the 10th century out of the states of at least part of Burgundy, and in fact not the lands that would be part of the Duchy of Burgundy, so what we know as Bourgogne. Especially today, except for a little part. We're talking mostly about the county of Burgundy. It was another thing. And in fact, I made a video specifically titled "The Kingdoms," plural, of Burgundy, exactly because of the various swings that this area, that, as we will see, is quite diversified within itself. Really had, politically speaking, throughout all these centuries, as fundamentally a frontier between mostly, in fact, we're talking about France and the Empire. Right, there are essentially two areas, right? The northeastern part that is more, it's kind of closer properly to the Germanic world. It covers great swaths of today's Switzerland, and in fact was kind of more directly involved in the political life of the Kingdom of Germany. Right, there are many famous dynasties, including the Zangan, the same Habsburgs, that were connected to those lands. Think about the Lake of Lausanne, also the Savoy, right across the Alps, and then a southern part, which in part is the same Rhone valley, which has in the northern part the Burgundian estates properly, historically, right? And in the south, what was in fact still part of the broader Burgundian kingdom since the migration era, kind of carving itself out as an important urban maritime power around Arles. These were some of the most intensely Romanized lands of the empire, that had basically a different character on its own. That's the reason why we talk about Burgundy/Arles, because Burgundy is more like the continental part and Arles the south. That was, of course, a Mediterranean coastal area, and as such, particularly influenced by Spain, but also more broadly by, especially in the previous centuries to these two Saracen invasions. They're the same lands in which the base of Fraxinetum, for example, from which the Saracens arrived across the Alps, even into the Rhineland, were located. and that for, say, most of the late Middle Ages maintained very deep contacts, if not de facto properly a governance of some other, essentially Catalan power, right, that stretched along the coast, mainly from Barcelona, and that thus characterized this area, as we will see now, with some influences from Spain mostly, and we will see this now a bit in detail. So the old Burgundy, the one at least we're talking about in Carolingian times, had been carved out formally as the kingdom of Lothair, created by the Treaty of Verdun in 843, right? So by the end of the 11th century, we're looking at now, the kingdom consisted, it was properly a kingdom, it had a crown, right? It consisted, as we've seen, of what is now essentially Western Switzerland, France, east of the Rhone, and so on, at least the modern country. Again, because this was not considered France as such. Plus a few districts west of these rivers, right? And so all this area had been mostly drawn in the orbit of the Holy Roman Empire. Essentially, the German monarchy had managed to hinge together with Italy, albeit in a separated way, like it would also happen with Bohemia later on, this kingdom to the broader Germanic domination. Right, the power had remained always very decentralized, as we'll see now, and this is reflected by its warfare. These lands had a very autonomous kind of character, and also a pretty fragmented one, a more urbanized than the average. So it's an interesting blend between France, Germany, and Italy as well. And all the influences from all these countries are, in fact, reflected in the area, right? In any case, and we've seen it, especially through the videos about the Dauphin, during the 13th and the first half of the 14th century, much of essentially the western part, but also great part probably of the southern one. So the one especially through which the Rhone ran, which was historically in fact the boundary between the Kingdom of France and the one of Burgundy, were gradually absorbed by the Capetian monarchy. Right, some territories like Lyon, for example, that, albeit being on the right bank of the Rhone, so from the French side, was part of Burgundy, simply dedicated itself to the French king, right, as a protector, etc. So we've seen all the political reasons behind this, but the main one being that this kingdom had failed to evolve into a national monarchy, in part because it was smaller than the other post-Carolingian ones. It was not necessarily actually the worst in terms of centralization, especially just after the disgregation of the Carolingian Empire, as we've seen recently in the video about Hugo of Provence, that also got the Italic crown at some point. It could even properly carry out some policy overseas. In any case, first of all, again, the Burgundian and the Arlesian part were somehow divided. They didn't have enough power, if not by bleeding themselves both white in the process, to reunite this power. There were lots of, again, aggressive dynasties that, especially in the north, that could have even still, by the 11th century, made something very interesting happening, dynastically speaking. Like the Duchy of Burgundy could have been properly ruled by the Counts of Burgundy, and there would have been a sort of superstate also stretching to northwestern Italy, at least for superstate for the feudal standards, fragmentation of the time, a completely different political entity. But this, for dynastic reasons, didn't happen. It was very difficult to dislodge all the various lords, especially in the Alpine valleys and so on. There was plus this kind of more equal distribution of wealth, a bit like in the rest of Occitania. which meant that technically communes were stronger by a degree, not enough to curb the nobility, however was not even too much able to assert its own power on most of the cities, or even just a provincial scale, right, that could hold on the longer run, because it cost a lot, as we've seen the same Dauphin that emerged as dramatic power went kind of bankrupt in the process. Plus, again, it was under the influence of powerful neighbors, especially from the 10th, 11th century. Again, the Germans assert themselves on it, and even if they can't control it directly and basically never show up for the rest of the Middle Ages so much that France can simply grab it at some point without too many issues. The area, in fact, witnesses a lack of centralization and remains a bit dispirited. It is effectively an aborted kingdom by late medieval times that doesn't have even much of a sense of itself, if not the fact that somebody had its crown somewhere, mostly like the Germans. So there were other, the Italic kingdom had definitely not evolved, for example, in a monarchic direction, but at least there were other powers that could fundamentally concentrate very large amounts of power there. We've seen also the German monarchy at a point, as a public state collapses, but there are still powerful, private principalities that manage still to maintain the institutional thing on standing. And even the Kingdom of France, that seemed in fact the single most fragmented after Carolingian times, is actually the one that compacts the most and manages to even take great parts of the Burgundian lands, right? So again, this is nothing to do with Burgundy, the Duchy of Burgundy, right? This is another land. So when we look at this land, first of all, you understand it's very diverse within itself. It fundamentally doesn't have a real political center, and it's also under the influence of other countries. So when you look at it, you can't really speak. Before I said Portugal is a small entity, but Portugal, you see, evolved, for example, into something pretty unitary that could compete even, say, with Castile. We have seen it in various videos. I have a medieval Portugal playlist. This thing, instead, by not managing to concentrate power, also doesn't develop any kind of unique military system, and doesn't seem to have had any major distinctive feature in this field. All right. The only exception that spices up a little bit the thing, just exposed, is the fact that this region includes the Swiss mountains, and some communities that make up, in fact, the Swiss Confederacy, are the ones covered by this video. In part, made videos about Swiss warfare, about properly confederal military history from the Middle Ages to the contemporary era. So we've seen where the Swiss were coming from with their military and why they were important, etc. Today, we, however, cover a part of their history that, aside from the last half century, when in fact they make their exploit with the Battle of Morgarten, and their infantries start weighing something in European warfare. That's one of those areas that are fascinating to look at, because up to that point they had been fundamentally anonymous, actually depressed, and compared at least to the surroundings, there were some more feudal and quite powerful areas instead. However, there were some characteristics even of the Swiss mountaineers at this point as peasant infantry forces that are worth looking at. For the rest, again, we can't look at anything quite specific. The land was under considerable French, some German, and some Italian influence, but other than that, as we'll see now, everything is pretty standard by Western European standards, in fact. Is there anything at all we can point out, like on average impressions? Well, first of all, we will look at these lands at some point in greater detail, their history, specific battles. There ain't really too much in terms of military history compared to, again, the bigger battles or campaign, whatever, but there is always some very interesting things to look at. So we can point out, first of all, that having failed as a kingdom and having remained significantly decentralized, the feudal forces always maintained, until actually very late in the Middle Ages, a consistent relevance in the local military organization. Again, it was all a fragmented mess, with lords maintaining very kind of old ancestral prerogatives on their lands, always fighting with each other because they didn't have so much enough to centralize themselves, but still maintaining that prerogative, and this was showed in their military organization. As in fact, the feudal levy remained important throughout the entire 11th and the 12th century, when in other countries things were, say, slightly modernizing a bit comparatively. It's not, even later on you do find again this feudal preeminence, except it wouldn't become, that's part of the reason why the land was overrun by more advanced systems like the French ones. In any case, as in other western parts of the empire and in Italy, such, let's call them Burgundian, generically feudal troops still had to be paid if sent beyond their own locality, which was again somehow normal, because as fragmented as the areas were, there were also more special treatment from the greater powers to these local ones, right? So you couldn't quite impose to these knights too much stress, right? Because you couldn't simply control them, and mostly they would take care of affairs just locally in their own feuds, in their own political marriages, and so on. In this sense, it was a ferocious land in many ways, and as elsewhere in the Holy Roman Empire, however, the feudal hosts declined during especially the second half of the 12th century, which meant in practice that also Burgundy updated at least to the reliance on mercenaries as an alternative, that still maintained anyhow the presence of feudal contingents next to them. And by a degree you can't even quite distinguish too much the two things, because many mercenaries were the same local knights, right? It's just that by influences from other countries, general revival of the era, economically, demographically, there is a bit more political and social built up hierarchically, statally. So you find local lords that have considerable retinues that can organize them. There is a market for war. And there will be historically lots of knights serving in other countries as well, right? Because Provençals, Burgundians, if you read, I don't know, Italian sources during the 13th, the 14th century, as we'll see now, the fact that Charles of Anjou, so the Pierre of France, brother of Louis IX, became ruler of the land from which he launched his crusade against Manfred in Sicily, and maintaining connections with Naples in that sense, but also creating a sort of bridge between across the Alps between, in fact, Provence and Piedmont, poured a substantial amount of mercenaries or nobles or officers, right, into Italy in that case, right? So an important part also of commanders came from the air, but not only. Right, there were also substantial infantries, as we will see now. Nothing clamorous. We don't remember any significant Burgundian infantry exploit, generally speaking, in European warfare. However, they still contribute. I mean, the fact that they're not protagonistic because there's not much of focus on any centralized reality here doesn't mean that Burgundians didn't operate in significant ways, also in tactical roles that were quite prized at the time. The same, as we will see, will be true for the Swiss, that were, for example, being employed as anonymous mercenaries. I mean, without any particular specialty at this point, but still in the Italian armies that were, as you know, quite advanced at the time. And there is Verbruggen and other historians, including the Swiss historiography, that point out how the experience in the Italian armies contributed to the development of Swiss infantry at home, even though they were something more primitive still, but they, considering their mountaineer background, they also were a bit more, kind of warlike by background for defending their territory. They were enough. So the general, say, professionalism of this era kicking in can be illustrated by the presence of mounted crossbowmen, for example, making their appearance, at least the earliest known, in the 13th century. They were presumably mostly paid professionals, as in other areas around, a bit of as a tactical specialty. These troops actually existed everywhere since ever. Just at this point, we start seeing them packed in specific salaried units that tell us that, of course, there is an important degree of mercenary activity carried out by these troops. Again, the land varies dramatically, because if you look at an alpine mountaineer, he will be, again, very rough. There will be a lot of raiding warfare. This tactical specialties could serve everywhere, right? So there's nothing necessarily specific about some areas rather than others, but you can see where some of the wildest troops came from. Mostly were the mountaineer background. Some of the most also drilled and collectively trained from, for example, the Provençal coastal cities. In fact, crossbows were vital weapons in Provençal fleets that were active at the time. They were heavily influenced by Italian warfare because, as we've seen in videos like the one about Genoa or Pisa, those maritime republics fought themselves literally in Occitania at sea, with these local towns essentially siding with one or the other because they were fundamentally economically absorbed by the Italian markets, and they resented also the military influence and so on. And comparatively, when you look, for example, at the Swiss, at least in terms of records, the crossbows are not seen until the early 13th century, which tells you also a bit kind of still the backwardness of the mountaineers that surely had crossbows, but not enough for us to document them satisfactorily, as opposed to a kind of more entrepreneurial coastal center, right, of southern France. It's important to stress, however, that the continental nature of power, but the Franco-Burgundian feudal lifestyle was pretty alive. Also, a few kilometers inland, if you want, and that we're not talking about the same level of republican development of the Italian communes. Here, the idea, it's a bit like in the county of Toulouse, right? There is a communal power, but also a feudal power overlapping, and nobody really takes over the other by balance. So mostly these lands look like France, right? Approximating between Germany, France, and Italy, right? Characterly speaking. So these mountain peasants of today's Switzerland, right? These are something. They mostly were the same, right? At least as Germanic communities. Some were very ancient. These were historically, at least in the Alpine valleys, the descendants of the Alemannic refugees into the Ostrogoth at the frontiers of the Ostrogothic kingdom, that were in fact settled there as military colonists after Clovis crushed them at the Battle of Tolbiac, right? And they had survived basically in the highest grounds, inhabited grounds of Europe, always struggling against nature. So they were quite tempered, quite tough, but also quite primitive and backwards, as we've seen. They were similar in this sense. Some of them inhabited what we call, in fact, the Burgundy here within the boundaries of the kingdom. But they were akin to the Germans of the Duchy of Swabia, that again was in the northeastern part of this land, quite like the continuity of the same kind of ethno-linguistic area. In the Burgundian north of the kingdom of Arles, you had instead again something definitely more similar to the French feudalism in many ways. Again, in the Duchy of Swabia, as we've seen, of course, it was a German feudalism, also the most receptive kind to Western Frankish warfare. However, the Alpine war was quite different on its own. It was at the outskirts of the, of civilization, let's say, until basically the 13th century. It's Frederick II that confirms important trade rights to these communities, which, when the Swabian dynasty collapses, basically swarmed a bit into the vacuum that had formed. They formed their own league, and they basically keep other nobility like the Habsburgs that were rising at that point out, as you know. And the game had always been around this. The Zerga, the Habsburgs themselves had always played in, again, Swabia, Alsace, Switzerland, Burgundy, right? Actually, the Habsburgs themselves, except for one ring of the chain that is missing genealogically, probably stem from a Romano-Burgundian senatorial family from the migration here. So that tells you a bit like the how fluid this area really was, right? And how profitable, in fact, for a more built-up power to expand in it, except it was a very peripheral, decentralized land. The Habsburgs went, as you know, in the completely opposite direction in the east of Germany. There were other famous powers actually strengthening their control here, such as Savoy, that gradually eroded also, for example, the power of the Dauphin over time. There were terrible wars, sieges, in these impervious lands with castles, mountains, forests, and so on. And again, we will hopefully look at that in detail. But coming back to the Swiss, well, they essentially gradually explored their surroundings politically and militarily. Also because many of them had participated. Again, we talk about the Swiss today as a nation. At this time, the thing did not exist. These were essentially Swabians, like others, except there were some communes there, more mountain, located. In some cases, right, the most powerful centers of the league were naturally in the lower lands, in the richest centers. In fact, in any case, they figured on. They wouldn't figure as Swiss, in fact, on payrolls, of the few ones actually we can track for even the 13th century, the 14th century. But as far as it's been, documented, many Swiss served, as we were saying before, as mercenaries in northern Italy, especially during the 13th century, where they learned advanced infantry tactics. Right? They weren't able. They didn't have properly the means to replicate what the Italians were doing in terms of major armies of tens of thousands of men with multiple battle lines, cavalry in the center, infantry on the wings with combined arms, crossbowmen in the rear, pikemen in the front. However, they were pretty much in between all these actors. Think about Henry VII of Luxembourg expedition into Italy, the role of the Savoy as middleman between Italy, France, and even England. The Swiss are around these events, right? They do fight with the same people who fought, say, with the Flemish infantrymen, Flemish communes that went to war again from north to south of the Alps in the Angevin Empire, with fiefs, say, in southern Italy, in Provence, in northern France, in Greece. So it was all a huge war. Most of these peasants were just bystanders when they served as humble file and rank troops. But when coming home, they would naturally pile up this experience and thinking of what they could do in this moment of great revival of infantry, especially in the early 14th century when they scored this dramatic victory at the Battle of Morgarten. Right? Seemingly, they were also, by the 13th century, skilled in crossbow warfare, probably because, again, of what they had learned in Italy, that was making the largest use of that. And in the first half of the beginning, I would say in the early 14th century, that they, for the first time, astonished Europe with the successful defense of their mountainous homeland against knightly cavalry, and becoming de facto one of the, at least of the sturdiest infantries in Europe. Always remember what the Swiss accomplished to really change deeply Western warfare, as far as properly the Renaissance, beginning with square pikes and so on, from the mid-15th century, is not what happened in the 14th century. 14th century, they fought mostly again as just a very primitive mono-arm system, which was basically just standing there, not moving. Differently, in fact, from what they would do later, where they instead passed on to the attack on a regular basis. Mostly they exploited very well the terrain, they ambushed their enemies, they prevented them from deploying, all these kind of things. They could do them in this, again, kind of frontier area. As far as succeeding in winning their own autonomy and de facto independence later on, they were an example. So developing also a sense of themselves. Mostly you can attribute their success to some high discipline. Mostly was a sense of community, right? They didn't need that. They were, again, these infantries were so primitive. They mostly stemmed conceptually from the late antique Germanic Fulcon, as opposed to anything that by this point had dramatically developed actually in the medieval art of war, especially as far as infantry was concerned, right? So that's why this differs radically from what happened in the mid-15th century. Probably has, if not, again, the political identity, practically nothing to do with the thing military-wise. In fact, by the way, differently from the following century, most Swiss were equipped with the halberd, the vogue, and not the pike as the primary weapon. That naturally required a completely different level of collective training that, again, they wouldn't have until later in time. In any case, these weapons were fierce. They were said, perhaps with a bit of excess, that you could cut in half a knight on saddle, this kind of thing. So there were can openers, but mostly when the knight was, again, stopped, unhorsed, blocked on the ground, and this you can do only if you kind of ambush them, if you manage to stop them, first of all, with a solid pike line that at this point is used defensively and just by the very first ranks, 1 or 2, right, and the rest is just what you have to do when the cavalry attack. If the cavalry attack is contained by this infantry, is given that cavalry will be at its weakest when it's stopped, because it cannot defend by definition, is pass into the counterattack, but locally, right within the same battle line, and not as a broader maneuver that, again, requires a dramatic amount of collective training. That is what the Swiss will develop for all the other Europeans to imitate just later on, more than 1 century, essentially 1 century later. So this is, say, the best I can outline in general about this Burgundian warfare. We can, however, look at some iconographic example of some source, some archaeological evidence, just to say, like, 2 things. First of all, again, the Saracen influence in the very first centuries that may have actually continued from not as Islamic influence, but anyhow some kind of Iberian influence that, as we've seen also in the videos about Iberian warfare at the same time, was substantially different, and by the 11th to 12th century also was possibly even more advanced than French and Italian arms and armor, military technology in general. It's a mild evidence, right, just from a couple of sources that, like, here of course there are hundreds of that you could possibly pick, but let's just look at the most meaningful. Regarding this topic, we see, for example, in the reliquary of Saint Candide in Savoy, dating to the early 12th century. This is preserved in the treasury at the Abbey of Saint Maurice in Valais, today's Switzerland. A representation of hauberks, right? And there is a lamellar model, right, which was conventionally at the time used to indicate infidel armor. As you know, we've seen this often in Iberian warfare. There is, generally speaking, a bit all over Western Europe, but here it may have stemmed from a more direct exposure to that, right? However, swords and sword belts are typically European, and there was definitely a mix of influences there, or something that could be copied in different ways. Consider that there was a broader, also Eastern influence. I mean, lamellar armor was quite popular even up to 13th, 14th century in Germany, in Italy, like from the steppes, from Byzantium. There was that kind of lamellar flavor that leaves pretty late in time. More meaningful about this topic are some relief carvings on the southern side of cloisters at the Church of Saint-Trophime at Arles in France, dating to the early 13th century. And it's a very beautiful place. I had the fortune of visiting, by the way. And here the images are a bit deteriorated, like the carvings are damaged at least. However, hauberks are represented meaningfully also here with some important detail, showing indeed that this armor made of scale-covered fabric or leather. So these figures do not have coifs. They have short sleeves. One appears to have some kind of strap, especially. Perhaps to tighten a flap-like sleeve around the upper arms, right? And this is somehow untypical compared to, especially at this point, early 13th century armor. In other words, we don't know whether such scale armor was used in Provence, whether it was like an artistic license or something. Again, always stylized on the base of the lamellar cuirass of the infidel type was concerned. We don't know. We just notice statistically there may have been kind of similar armor around with this characteristic. Another interesting feature are the helmets, which appear to be of two-piece construction, joined along a low comb. For the rest, considering we are in the early 13th century, there is very old-fashioned kite-shaped shields. This sword and scabbard are instead pretty much updated to Western tradition. Still at Saint-Trophin, but looking at other elements of armor in the west front of the church of Saint-Trophin, we find one of the earliest Provençal illustration of separate male coif of the early type, which basically consists with the squared lower edges that fall on the neck, on say the back, the chest. For the rest, this still dates from the early 13th century. Hauberks look ordinary and male. However, here the swords are of the almost parallel-sided, non-tapering type that are met in some Mediterranean sources, which was suggest even here as sort of perhaps even still old Islamic influence. Consider again the Arabs remain as a presence until the 11th century in the area, right? So the idea that the tapering sword is mostly something designed to already start hitting in the joints of a pretty consistent armor, whereas lighter equipment connected with especially North Africa, the lighter skirmishing troops, also you can see in the Reconquista, etc., would bring to more cutting weapons because of the lighter armor that entails, and that's why we would connect the two things per se. Again, consider that there is an important Iberian influence in southeastern France at this point, right? So a lot of types of warfare, of armor, of technology that was used in Spain at the time, albeit again most of the influence came from the most westernized kind of Francicized areas like Catalonia, etc. That still was in contact with I don't know, the Muslims. Think about the Balearic Islands, the Reconquista in places like Valencia and so on. We made a bit about the Kingdom of Valencia. Still, make us look at the situation in Provence. Again, is also the most exposed, as opposed to the Burgundian continent, to these influences as still somehow pretty standard Western European context. In the treasury of the Abbey of Saint Maurice in Valais, Switzerland, we can admire a reliquary chest of the Abbé Nantelme. This was from Savoy, dating to 1225, illustrating the story of Saint Maurice. Right, and we have here interesting influence instead from the north, right? Because Savoy was substantially influenced by also German warfare. We see an early, in fact, German form of great helm, which is flat-topped, but relatively close-fitting, and that doesn't even extend far down the neck, as it was kind of more typical for the Great Helm. All the figures represented were mail coif and hauberks with mittens. One is clearly slit horizontally across the palm, and that's how they basically wore it. We find all the typical packages, kind of heavily armored knights of the time. These are the times of Frederick II. We see mail chausse, a pair which are of the early type, which is laced up the back of the leg, so not wearing them like in fact a sock, but just leaving essentially the back of the leg just uncovered, because they cost, right? And you also want it to be lighter as much as you can, and this speaks of a more frontal fighting. But still, crossbows, as we've seen in the area, kind of more advanced tactics are around. Generally speaking, we can say that these lands are not particularly, let's say, overbearingly rich as such. So from all those little, say in Savoy, there was already also an important princely development in a kind of stattal direction. Whereas if you look from the other side, especially the one of the Rhone Valley, you see smaller lordships, were, as we said, that were also a bit more isolated, because from one side you have the Alps, from the other the Massif Central. Nobody is really interfering too much. At best, you are the one going abroad, and you would maybe economize, because the local warfare was a little more primitive and kind of poor. But it's just, again, it could be just a coincidence. But tendentially, we can track that. Two figures on this reliquary have padded cuisse with some form of pollain to protect the knee. When you look at Saint Maurice himself, he has a surcoat with shoulders that are so raised that it's believed that there was some kind of rigid or semi-rigid cuir bouilly protection worn beneath, which wouldn't be so strange, that at this point there was, and it would develop over time, a so-called, here the thing actually has yet to happen, but later on, the so-called Provençal Tuscan military style, mostly the ones of the Guelph Angevin papal world, that again drew troops from Provence, also from Naples, but again, these are, especially during the season of war, pretty hot areas, right? So they tended to lighten themselves up with something that would absorb heat less than metal, and that would make them lighter by a degree. So that area, like of the Ligurian, the Tyrrhenian Sea, would be producing, let's say stereotypically, this kind of greater amount of boiled leather armor, whereas kind of the north of Italy, the Lombard Ghibelline area, would be having more German, as we've seen also in the case of Savoy, actually, influenced arms and armor by a degree, tendentially, as vectors, we can say. So this could be a precursor of something that we see in Provençal mercenaries. There is the commander, the Provençal commander's tomb for the Battle of Campaldino, for example, that has the best representation in 13th century war for this kind of arms and armor combination with cuir bouilly. Here I haven't inserted it, but we will look at it in some other video. I use it every once in a while in my generic kind of 13th century warfare videos. Then we have, and I inserted here the pictures towards the end, the relatively famous wall paintings from the Tour Ferrand at Pernes-les-Fontaines in France. This is Provence, and the frescoes date to the mid to the late 13th century, right? And they depict essentially the war between the Angevins and the Hohenstaufen. So they celebrated the quite current affairs of the crusade against Manfred and Victor of Charles of Anjou in 1266. Again, they had left from Provence, so the locals were celebrating this victory. Then there is Yair the Infidel, this picture with the Moor, that is usually it's similar to the one from a illuminated manuscript that shows this Saladin and Richard Lionert fighting. So this echoed the Crusades that were pretty much alive still at the time. And again, this kind of Western Mediterranean land being perhaps, and especially Provence, a bit more reminiscent of that idea of the Moor present as at least as the stereotypical enemy we'll see now. And then again, mostly the war between the Angevins and the Hohenstaufen. That was definitely the main theme. So if you look at them artistically, they're fairly simple frescoes, right? They aren't very complex wall paintings just per se, stylistically. However, they do contain many interesting features as far as the panoply is concerned and some other broader characterization. For example, the Infidel is curiously, but understandably from one side, and largely stylized and equipped in European style. Right? What are the differences? Well, fundamentally just he has no head protection. He just has a sort of head cloth of some kind. He carries a small round buckler. That was the way the Westerns said that these guys are a bit more hit and run troops. They're lighter. So that was a feature associated with the stereotyped Saracen at the time. Then, as far as the battles between the Angevins and the Swabians are concerned, they actually display features that you would find in the actual theater of Italy that was quite connected with Provence historically, especially Tuscany, that had supported with her bankers, had financed the entire Angevin crusade for the papacy, and now we're actually swarming, in southern Italy, being subcontracted with the main local resources, especially Sicilian grain, as a reward, and thus also financing a great deal of arms and armor production, consumption, market, and so on, and so blending in with all these Provençal, Tuscan, Neapolitan, French styles, etc. So that they are somehow accurate from these frescoes, how they are depicted, and some of these fighters, especially in combat, wear conical great helms, which shows how also here we are in theory in the full Provençal Tuscan style of some sort, and of course great helms were used by the French as well, by the Italians. It was completely normal. Some have plumes or streamers. Again, this is the idea, is that stereotypically, because there is a source about the Battle of Benevent that says that, is that the Provençals had skilled themselves in, it's a bit, even the Chapelle de Fer, as the idea that there were this kind of lighter horsemen. They were kind of substantially armored, but not as heavily armored as this heavy German Swabian knights with a great helm and the plate armor and so on, and so that they would just specialize with the stock in, transfixing the armpits that were uncovered from the Swabians in the of the Swabians during combat and winning. Of course, the Charles of Anjou didn't win because of that, but still there was the idea again that especially France, this was mostly a French thing, had gone forward especially in the size, especially of cavalry warfare deployment, and so had began also to specialize troops, including these lighter types, were designed to support the heavier ones in taking out the heavies, you know. So that's also what the style was about. But again, we see that the heavier guy that still, in fact, dominates the battlefields, especially in these years, like Western chivalry, is at the top, right? It's dramatically advanced. Is just well represented in the frescoes. In fact, there are lighter troops as well, with close-fitting cervelières, which also becomes, especially towards the early 14th century, but was already around, this kind of option. Because normally, you know that under the great helm you would have the cervelière. It's just a cap. It's just like the intercisa cap of the late antique Roman army, you know. And then with mail underneath, etc., and various layers again of defense. We will see some of them now in detail from the monument of Otto the Grandson. One seems to be wearing also a form of slightly pointed bassinet at this point. The only clearly visible armor is of mail, as it would be typical at the time, albeit plate armor was already spreading, was some of the most updated stuff coming around pretty much everywhere. We see full hauberks, fundamentally, with mittens, coifs, and chausses, so as you would expect from normal knightly equipment of the time. Shields are of the small flat-topped type, which is also fundamentally accurate. You know, the shields were becoming ever smaller, rectangular, and thus just almost bucklers if it had not been for the shape. And as soon as plate armor prevailed, fundamentally shields were gradually being abandoned, especially in the 15th century. You know, so there was no need even for such a small shield to be concave as well, because it was not to envelope the knight. It was too small. It could just serve as an extra defense. But armor was becoming substantially as heavy as making these shields just accessory somehow. Consider at this point here, like from the last decade of the 13th century, also double-handed swords were coming around, except you can't use them on horseback, right? So at least you could use the shield in that case, if, say, slung over the back, or tied to the wrist, to the forearm, or just as an epaule, right, or on the arm. In any case, in this frescoes, spears in mounted combat are the dominant weapon, right? Tapering swords with slightly downturned quillon also appear, which suggests a bit, especially from the quillon, that kind of direction for some kind of a 1.5 hand towards a 2-hand grip, right? At least some grip that could help addressing better with the other hand, the main one. Then also, since we made some weeks ago the video about the Siege of Acre, in which this guy figures prominently, I think we can analyze briefly the effigy of Otto the Grandson. So he was a Burgundian Savoyard, actually. His effigy dates to 1330, is to be admired at the Cathedral of Lausanne, today's Switzerland. And it has some interesting characteristic. First of all, for the early 14th century, this panoply is somehow old-fashioned, and one of the reasons may be the fact that the guy lived for a very long time, and the effigy was perhaps made also consistently before he died, because they would spend a lot for it, so they planned it in some way. There are beautiful effigies of historical characters that, however, were made consistently later after their death, so the panoply had already evolved, and so they looked a bit more updated in death than they would have looked like in life, all geared. Again, the guy lived after a very old age. The curvature of the coif, you would say, what the hell, Schwerpunkt. Yes, it's interesting, because it is separate, right, over the size of his head, and it clearly indicates that there was a padded arming cap that not only covered his head, right, this thing was worn under mail and the serviliere, or it depends on how also the head protection was structured, but this one also extended around the guy's temples and chin as well. Right. However, since behind the chin the bulges formed by his ears equally clearly indicate that he was wearing nothing other than the mail itself lay over these, we can think that the layer of the padded arming cap was not present in correspondence to his ears, right? And one of the most important reasons would be, as always in military history, not to have your hearing impaired, so being able to listen to orders quite carefully, because at this time warfare was about a lot of specific orders, knowing when to charge, and everything had to be coordinated very, very carefully. This, from such a knight like him, this is an interesting characteristic you don't find much elsewhere that I know. Then the effigy shows a long-sleeved male hauberk with mittens worn under the surcoat, pretty normal, say. There is some tassel-like objects in his shoulders. Some said at some point they are ailette. There are these kind of little plaques, especially concave, that were attached to the shoulders that mostly deflected the cutting blows. Instead, they have apparently nothing apological about that, because they would be the heads of two small lions lying beneath the recumbent knight, which support his shoulders, right? So it would be just mere artistry to kind of glorify this individual, but yeah, that's how you can be fooled. And sometimes not everything in iconography is clear and neatly outlined, where you have to make a bit of effort looking a bit more frequently at things. In any case, this is pretty much the thing. Now, as I said at the beginning, it would be really a lot to talk about regarding Burgundian warfare, defining it better, looking especially at the various provincial realities in detail. Again, with the videos about the Dauphin, we began to do a bit of that, but we never talked about various other realities. Again, it's a very complicated area, and you can mostly find the basic information in my Burgundian history playlist that takes in consideration a bit everything from the broader region since the migration era, fundamentally. Onwards, we will look naturally at other regions of Eurasia and Mediterranean in detail. As far as warfare is concerned, again, I began last year, if I'm not wrong, or even slightly before, like 1 year and a half ago, and we have, again, the cycles are pretty long, pretty big wheel here, but we have seen Georgia, Germany, Portugal, Castile, and Leon together. Then we looked at England and Wales, interestingly enough, then now we have Burgundy. I think we looked at Scandinavia as well. Yes. Over also, I remember something. It may have been. No, maybe it was Hungary. Hungary too. Yes. But then we have to look at so many other areas. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.